Good morning, everybody. It's the first Thursday of the new month. It can only mean one thing. Yes, our government throwing more of their significant political capital away for no reason but self-pay. It happens on the first Thursday of every month, Tony. It coincides with the Football Transfer Forum as well. Great to see everybody on here. Tony, good morning. How are you?
Yeah, Ryan, I'm great. It's a lovely sunny day here in Newcastle. We're live from Newcastle and other parts of the world, apparently.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. A new jacket for today's webinar, Tony?
Yes, absolutely. If anyone's coming to the actual Football Transfer Forum live, and we'll talk about that later in the show, it's only less than 3 weeks away. This is me warm up for it. I've just sort of got to wear it in, and I've undone the pockets. You know, you've got all the zip,
the tags. Yeah, the tags. Have you cut the tags out?
I've cut the tags out. This is the warm up for the actual event.
Okay, very good. Well, that's got me excited. What's also got me excited is the topic of today's webinar, and it's a Newcastle United special. Before we introduce our guest, Tony, just say a few words about why are we doing this as a special? Do you really see it as this sort of significant seismic shift in the Premier League?
Well, I certainly do. I mean, and what the reason we're doing a special on it is it's just been the news story that's been going on for, well, maybe 3 or 4 years. I remember talking to some of the guys years ago about this very takeover, and was it happening? Was it going to happen? It was on and off, and then all of a sudden, and quite out the blue, I've got to say, the deal got done. Everyone in the city went a little bit takeover frenzy. There was a takeover frenzy in the city. You couldn't buy a tea towel at Waitrose for love nor money, and the fans absolutely, were joyous. They were celebrating. My 2 sons are Newcastle fans. They're just thinking, right, we can start looking up the league. We can start winning trophies. Let's get on with it. But I think some of the issues that we're going to talk about today go beyond just what happens on the pitch and what happens. They're about club, and they're about belonging, and they're about how you see yourselves as well. So I think it's a massively important issue. And I think, we probably missed out by not doing a Super League session when that was a Super League special, when that was all kicking off. And these things, people in football need to talk about them. We need to listen to the experts and people who know about the things in this area. So that's why I thought it was important to do it.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of experts, we've absolutely got 2 of the very best on today for everybody's delight, and to be learning from them, and certainly on this topic to be unraveling what is a quite delicate situation. First, we've got Simon Chadwick, Global Professor of Sport and Director of the Centre for Eurasian Sport at Lyon Business School. Matan, Simon, how are you?
What did you say? I didn't understand that last bit. I'm good, thank you. Yeah, speaking to you live and direct from Central Paris, where I work, maybe.
Fantastic, excellent. It's great for you to.
I'm actually in England at the moment, so I'm not waiting. I'll break that straight away. So
no,
yeah,
you couldn't keep that line going.
But I will reveal my Paris Saint-Germain top later on in the day. So
we would expect nothing left. And live from Liverpool, football finance extraordinaire, creator of the football. Price of Football podcast and book, Kieran Maguire. I'm not sure what to say to you, Kieran. How does it go? Hey up, lad. How's it going?
It's very good, thank you very much. I'll be talking in BBC English for the whole of this seminar.
Fantastic, excellent. Well, fantastic to have you both with us. Let me just share very, very quickly with everybody tuning in what this morning is going to look like. We've got Kieran for about half an hour, so we're going to be diving straight in what the numbers around the Newcastle deal have been and what they might mean for the future as well. And then we'll pass over to Simon, where we're going to look very much more at the political, the geopolitical aspects of what this deal and potential other deals might look like coming out of the Middle East. As always, guys, please feel free to share your contact details, any reasons about why you're tuning in today in the chat box. If you want to ask the guys or a general question, please pop it into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Makes my life much easier. Let's get going. Kieran, thanks again for joining us this morning. I know you've been kind of pinned down over the last the last month in terms of the build up to the deal, looking like it's finally going to happen, and then it obviously happening. I saw a great stat. Over 30,000 people tuned in to the court case that really sort of preceded this deal actually happening. Just give us a brief background on how you see how long this deal has actually taken to actually come to fruition.
Well, Mike Ashley has owned Newcastle. Did own Newcastle United for 14 years. And probably for 12 of those years, either explicitly or implicitly, he was trying to sell the club. The relationship with Amanda Staveley and PIF has been rumbling on for the last 3 to 4 years. We've seen other potential bidders sniffing around the club. There's been lots of tire kickers. But the one barrier to that deal proceeding was coming from the Premier League itself in terms of the owners and directors test. And specifically, was Newcastle United going to be owned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Or alternatively, was it going to be owned by an independent organisation? That was for the legal briefs on both sides to decide. And eventually, a few weeks ago, the legal representations or representatives of Newcastle United persuaded the Premier League to cave in, and then the deal went through practically. I think it took everybody by huge surprise that yes, we thought, well, the ducks are all in a line now, and then the deal was done in next to no time. So clearly, I think the people on both sides must have been very confident that they were going to get acquiescence from the Premier League, and I think it's £305 million. It's a fairish price. I've calculated the value of Newcastle United using a variety of valuation metrics, and it's round about there as a Premier League club. If a club in the bottom three of the Premier League, it's probably overvalued. But I think the new owners take the view that they just want to get it done.
Absolutely, and you're right. I think it dragged on, and then all of a sudden, done very, very quickly. Now it seems, on the face of it, now I've always been a little bit defensive towards Mike Ashley. I think he's ran that club not bad. I think if you strip away, the name of the owner or the name of the club, and you presented it to somebody, it might get a tick on your podcast, mightn't it? So he's ran the club relatively well. How much of this is a good deal for Mike individually? Have you had a chance to work out, whether he's actually made a profit out of it?
He has made a profit out of it. He bought it for around about 140. Their outstanding loans, the most recent accounts, were a further 110. So it looks as if he's made £50 million of profit. But if you then say, well, hold on, he's lent the money to Newcastle United interest-free, and normally you'd expect to get, if you look at David Gold and David Sullivan at West Ham, they're charging 4.5% interest. If you take that out of the equation, he'll have made a little bit of money, but nothing significant. And the paradox of Mike Ashley is that financially, he is the perfect owner if you are the next owner to acquire a football club, because you're not buying a club which is right at the limit of financial fair play limits. And therefore, there's actually a huge amount of wiggle room in terms of the capacity of the club to further invest on the field of play. So, based on my calculations, I think Newcastle had made an FFP profit of around about £100 million over the last 3 years. You're allowed to lose 105. So therefore, the new owners are immediately coming into a scenario in which they've got £200 million worth of wiggle room, plus any additional money they can generate through new commercial and sponsorship arrangements, which actually puts them in a very strong position if that's what they want to do.
Kieran, just so we can draw a line under the Mike Ashley era, and in the interests of fairness, from your point of view, has he run the club financially quite soundly then?
He has run it soundly from an objective of trying to avoid relegation. So what is the bare minimum spend to finish 17th in the Premier League? I think there are some areas where he can be accused of, I don't think negligence is the right word, but of running it with a view to a sale. So if you take a look at the infrastructure spending of Newcastle, and I did the calculations for the whole of the last decade. So it's easier to take numbers from 1 year's set of accounts and say, well, he's been bad there. But if you take a look over the 10 years, Newcastle had spent less money, significantly less money as well, than every other club that is presently in the Premier League. And we're talking about clubs such as Norwich, have only been there for a few years, and many of the others. Brentford, clearly they've moved to a new ground. Brighton have moved to a new ground, so you'd expect theirs to be a bit higher. But I think the lack of investment, it's the equivalent of, if you've got a car that you put up for sale and you know that the tyres are pretty close to the limit, you're not going to go and put 4 new tyres on the car because you're not going to get your money back from the new owner. And that's Ashley's. That's been Mike Ashley's approach. The downside is that the new owners will now have to invest significantly in infrastructure. So I think he can be criticised for that. But in terms of running it as a business, and remember, in the eyes of Newcastle United football fans, Newcastle United is not a business. It's the beating heart of the city, and it's part of their history and heritage. That's their element of criticism. If I'm looking at purely in terms of numbers, he's got a pretty smart plan.
Yeah, the rest of the Premier League clubs acted quite quickly soon after the deal, didn't they, Kieran? To a rule change. We'd see the tightening of rules around Kieran, in terms of the interconnected sponsorship. How much of a bump in the road do you think that is to the new owners?
I don't see that as being a huge issue, because if we take a look at what's come out from the Premier League, it's an interim 4-week decision which relates to what is referred to as related parties. Now, a related party is either somebody that owns the club, somebody who's on the board of directors, or you could have an investor who owns more than 20%. So that's the strict definition of what we refer to as related parties. Those rules are actually quite easy to circumvent. If we take a look at what's happened at Everton, Farhad Moshiri is the majority owner, but his former business partner, who does not qualify as a related party according to the rules, Elisha Usmanov, he's come in and he's spent £35 million on the naming rights, or sorry, an option for the naming rights for a football stadium that doesn't yet exist. That's a lot of money. He's also sponsoring with one of his other companies the women's front of shirt sponsorship for the women's team. He's got the naming rights for Finch Farm, the training facilities, and all of those deals look, I think the word I would say is benevolent stroke generous. And the same thing could apply to Newcastle United and their lawyers will be going through the fine print. And my observation is, when financial fair play first came into existence, I sat down just the evening it came out, and I came up with half a dozen ways and means of getting around the rules, if that's what you want to do. And I'm not saying that clubs do want to. Some clubs are very good on governance and ethics and so on. Others take a more relaxed approach to things. So I don't think Newcastle will like the rules if they come in, but I don't perceive them as being as preventing them from signing them. I think financial fair play in general is going to be more of a challenge than the related party rules.
Now we've seen we've seen an immediate sacking of Steve Bruce. Now it'll take a while, probably at least another 12 months, to see the detail of what that cost the football club. Obviously, the club is now going to enter a stage of a massive uplift in expenditure, mainly on human beings. What's your take on that, given the other examples that we've seen in the Premier League? It's not as easy to achieve as I think it's reported in the press, is it?
No, it's not, and the reason is, if we go back in time, when Roman Abramovich acquired Chelsea, there were two competing clubs to win the Premier League in the form of Manchester United and Arsenal. By the time Sheikh Mansour came into the equation, clearly we had Chelsea there. Liverpool weren't actually too much of a problem, because under Hicks and Gillette, they were not run particularly well, and Spurs had not entered being a challenging club either. So now we've got the ultra high net worth individuals who are funding Chelsea and Manchester City. So two clubs became four. I think you can add in Spurs because of the impact of the new stadium. Liverpool have incredibly smart owners who are very much monetary focused. So instead of competing with two clubs, Newcastle are going to have to push their way through six in order to achieve success. And again, if we look at things from a historical perspective, when both Abramovich and Mansour came into their respective clubs, there was no financial fair play, so you could afford to make hugely expensive mistakes. So Robinho, Joe, Wilfred Boney, and so on. I think Boney was perhaps a little bit later. But if you made that mistake, you just said, "I've got it wrong. I can park those wages, and yes, they're coming out of Roman's bank account. He's underwriting them." There was no need to worry. If you take a look at Manchester City in 2011, which was just before financial fair play came into existence, City lost £197 million in a single year. Now, Newcastle cannot do that because FFP will be acting as a drag, as an anchor on their ability to spend.
And Kieran, you mentioned some of the Man City players there. How have Newcastle been doing compared to those other clubs in the Premier League, right across the Premier League, in terms of transfer spending? Because it seems to me, the fans, I talk to the fans every day, and it sounds like the fans think we haven't spent money on players compared to our competitors. Is that really the case?
Well, I think you've got to ask yourself, who are Newcastle United's competitors? Certainly, if you take a look at the first 8 years of Mike Ashley's reign, there was a net spend per season of £700,000, which to me indicates it's an amazing achievement that they were not relegated on a more regular basis with that type of approach. Since then, he has taken the break off to a certain extent. Under Steve McLaren, there was a lot of expenditure that didn't work. But we have seen spending increase since, and I'm not a coach, I'm not a scout or anything of that nature. But purely from a financial point of view, I don't think they've got a very good return on their investment. In terms of Joe Linton, Almiron, Joe Willock's gone there. He's not getting in the first team anymore. You know, there's the thick end of £100 million spent on players with no return. And I think somebody put up on social media on Sunday or on Saturday the total value of Newcastle's bench, and it was about 150 million quid in terms of expenditure of players who can't get into a side which frankly is pretty mediocre in terms of the first 11. So I don't think it's necessarily the amount of money that's been spent in the last 5 years. I think what you've got to question is the quality of spending rather than quantity.
We've got to talk about a very, real threat of relegation to Newcastle as well. They're without a win. They're a very poor side. Currently managerless, although they're talking about Eddie Howe being appointed potentially today. Again, he's in the knowledge that he was not the first choice as well. Unai Emery turning the club down. The impact of a relegation, again, just a blip or real significant issues?
I don't see it as being critical. I think you've got to take a look at the long-term strategy, and I'm assuming that the new owners do have a long-term plan. It's a setback, but to a certain extent, it could work in the club's favour, because you could have a complete reset in the Championship, which would allow the club to, some of the players who are fringe might want to, move on, and this would encourage them to do so. So it's not going to prevent the long-term vision. Remember, Manchester City, they were in the 3rd division before Mansour came in, and they are what they are today. Ideally, in terms of wanting to set the rocket boosters to full thrust, you'd want to be in the Premier League for the next window as far as the summer is concerned. But being in the Championship, it's a relatively minor bump on the road, in my view.
Kieran, and there may be some people who have interest in Newcastle on the call. Are we looking at a Manchester City type scenario? Is the amounts of money we're talking about going to be that transformative? Is that what we're thinking?
Well, again, we don't know what are the intentions of the owners. Abramovich and Mansour made it clear immediately that they were looking for marquee signings, and they came through within days of those acquisitions taking place. With the Newcastle takeover, taking place in October, and therefore we could be in January, Newcastle could be in a fairly rickety position when the next window starts. They certainly have the capacity to spend, and I think it would be a challenge attracting players, because if we are looking at the marquee players, they're looking for two things. They're looking for Champions League participation. That is important to players. They are wealthy to begin with, so European participation is, I think we can probably say, unlikely this season is the politest way I can describe that. And the other thing would be, well, if you can't offer that, then you've got to go and make up for that in the form of remuneration.
Yeah.
So that they have the ability to spend. We're assuming the owners are going to spend, but I think it will be a challenge for Newcastle to recruit, because they are starting in a far worse off position. Chelsea were already 4th in the Premier League when Abramovich acquired them. City weren't, but they were still playing at a big stadium. They still were a club with a lot of potential, and not in the negative position that Newcastle are in at present.
Yeah. Kieran, I know you've got to go in 5 minutes, so just a couple of final questions. In terms of Newcastle going from being in the black to potentially heavily into the red, you and I are both sort of policy advising into the fair game groups, and there's obviously the big review into football going on as well. In terms of the overall dent it would have in terms of the professional game here in this country. How much of a blow will it be to the overall financial of the game?
I think the impact that it will have is that presently we've probably got 4 clubs willing to pay, perhaps 5, willing to pay elite levels of wages. Now there's going to be 1 more. So therefore, I think it's going to enhance wage inflation at the very top level. Now for the smaller clubs, the likes of Burnley and Palace and Norwich and so on, I don't think it'll have any impact. Because Newcastle will now be fishing in a different pond, and in fact, in a way, it could have a negative impact on wages at the lower level, because Newcastle are no longer looking for those players on, say, the 40 to 50 grand a week level, and they're now looking at the 120 to 150.
Absolutely, and that's exactly my point. So in the first instance, they're going to be competing with Villa, with Wolves, with Everton. That's going to, to steal a line from the podcast, Kieran, the agents will be getting the Range Rover catalogues out, won't they? Because the wages will be going up, the fees will be going up.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think if I was an agent for a player who was fringe but was still at one of these bigger clubs, especially if the player is 28, 29, so he's looking for one last contract, I think Newcastle could be a very attractive proposition.
Interesting, really, really interesting. Kieran, before we let you go, one last question. Let's fast forward 2 or 3 years. How do you see it panning out for Newcastle? How do you see these owners as long-term owners? It's obviously there's multiple people owning the football club. Do you see that surviving as well? How do you see it?
I think in an ideal world, they have seen that the benefits of the ownership of PSG and Manchester City for other ultra high net worth organisations in the Middle East, in terms of the publicity that it's generated. And they've been sniffing around at the club for so long. There's no point in being a short-term owner, because you're not going to make any money in the short term. So I think we will see that. I think that the closest analogy to Newcastle is Everton, and the new owners have spent over £500 million on players since Farhad Moshiri's come in.
Yeah,
and £500 million gets you nowhere. So
they're not very good, are they?
they're okay, but yeah, they're not where they expected to be, and I think the fear is that the same could happen for Newcastle, unless they go, well, 500 million is not enough, we have to go to another level, and then I think there will be issues in terms of opposition from within the game itself.
Yeah. Listen, thanks for your time, not only this morning, but for, I'm sure everybody's been listening to you over the past few weeks around this. I know you've worked extremely hard on it, so thanks for everything that you do for the game as well, Kieran, and thanks again for this morning.
Cheers. Right, I've got to dash. I've got a lecture to deal, but I'll hand you across to Simon.
Oh, brilliant.
And I do like the fact that he's got a very French style jumper on.
Thanks, Kieran.
Very good. Thank you, Kieran. Well, absolutely. Let's move straight across to Simon. I mean, I think the first question is your sort of reaction to what Kieran's been talking about.
I'm not going to make a direct reaction immediately to Kieran. I'm going to make a general reaction, which is everybody's ball watching. That's what seems to be happening with this debate around Newcastle United. And that's what's been happening for the last 18 months. Everybody's been ball watching. It's interesting because I read Simon Cooper's book about Barcelona, and he was talking about Pep Guardiola. And he says Pep Guardiola, he's something incredible, like 80 eye movements a minute during a game. It's just, and I think, right, instead of watching the ball, you need to be watching the game the bigger game that's going on, and that's where I come from today. Is obviously I've got the right hairstyle for it, but it's that 70 or 80 eye movements a minute to look at the bigger picture rather than ball watching. It's interesting because I listened to what Kieran was saying, the questions that you asked. I mean, the reality is that the Saudi Arabians weren't interested in Newcastle United. They weren't. Because if you go back 3 or 4 years to stories around the Public Investment Fund, they were actually interested in buying Manchester United. And for those of you who know the Gulf, and I've been working in the Gulf now for 11 or 12 years, when they buy big, they buy the best. And so they went straight into United. And it seems as though the Glazers didn't want to sell. And then when the Glazers became a little more receptive to selling, the price being quoted apparently was anything up to £3 billion. So at that point, Saudi Arabians pulled back. Interestingly, and I took a lot of flack from Newcastle United fans, but I didn't care because I thought I was right. And I still think I'm right even now, is I've been tracking Saudi Arabian government policy on sport now for about 6 years. And even now, there's nothing, zilch, to suggest that buying an overseas football club is part of their plan. It's just not there. So I think one of the reasons for that is that Saudi Arabian football is actually very strong.
Yep.
As a national team, qualifies for the World Cup. In terms of club teams, I mean, some of those big club teams like Al Ittihad, for example, they're drawing almost as many fans per week on average as Newcastle United. So, why would you buy an overseas football club? So that therefore leads us into, I think this was a speculative purchase. It was, they did because they can. Brought about by the intermediaries involved, some of whom are still involved in the club. A deal was punted to them. The Saudi Arabians said, yeah, okay. And away we went. And I think it is, we've got evidence that this was a speculative purchase, because obviously the whole being Qatar, World Trade Organization, somebody didn't do their homework, because that was inevitably going to become an issue, and away we go. So my view is this is speculative. So, all of this talk about, long term, what's going to happen, this is going to happen, what I don't know. It's a speculative purchase. The one thing that I would do is when we're talking about financial figures, 300 million quid, and as Kieran was talking, I checked. So we know, for instance, that Saudi Arabia is going to launch a new national airline. And this new national airline is intended to compete with Qatar Airways and Emirates Airlines. And we know what Emirates Airlines in particular, its relationship with Arsenal, with Real Madrid, with AC Milan, with Hamburg, with various other sponsorships around the world. So Saudi Arabia will put the new national airline's name on Newcastle United shirts at some stage over the next 2 years. I worked out a TV advert in Britain at peak time. One TV advert will cost you 50,000 quid. What you've got for 300 million quid is advertising all day, every week, for a year, across 204 territories in the world, who will know your national airline. So if you want to start kind of adding up the numbers, and it's not about Newcastle United making a profit necessarily. It is about, I think in the first instance, Saudi Arabia will use the club not to win and say, hey, look at us, we're great. They're going to use the club as a means through which to achieve other ends. And one of those other ends, and I'm sure you're going to ask me other questions, Ryan, about what those other ends might be. Newcastle United is an advertising vehicle. It's a global advertising vehicle, and it's cheap at 300 million quid.
And Simon didn't actually do that in himself anyway. Did he not benefit from that? And I see the signs are still up and everything else.
I mean, it's really interesting, because if you think about your Sports Direct experience, let's say you got a Nike Town in Oxford Street in London. Yeah. If you've ever been to Nike Town in Oxford Street in London, or if you've been in a Nike lab. So I was in Paris working.
I've been in a nightclub, but not a night lab.
The last time I was in Paris, I went to a Nike lab. These are incredible places. You go to Sports Direct because it's cheap and cheerful. And actually not so cheerful, thinking about more Sports Direct. So you're cheap. But, the kind of cheap and cheerful brand proposition, Tony, that's Newcastle United, cheap and cheerful. And so in terms of the brand,
right,
I think it probably served its purpose for him.
So in terms of I really agree with how you framed it in terms of how people have been ball watching. In terms of the actual sort of sign off to actually go ahead, even if it is a speculative acquisition, like you say, in terms of the structure of the organisations are involved, has it still been a political decision at some point in terms of the individuals involved?
Well, the interesting thing, Ryan, is last year, the Public Investment Fund, mid-pandemic, at the time when the Newcastle United stories were raging, they spent $3 billion on Facebook shares and $3 billion on Disney shares.
Yeah.
And within 2 months, they'd sold them. So they're into trading, they're into wheeling and dealing, and this suggests that Newcastle United will serve a purpose for Saudi Arabia that holding Disney shares and Facebook shares won't.
Yeah.
But it also suggests that something else happened. And I think what also happened, this something else, is that the British government got involved. And we've seen, you said right at the top of the show, Ryan, we have a particular type of government in this country right now. And for me, their grubby fingerprints are all over this issue. Because it's essentially this was just a football club purchase, random, speculative. But then what starts to happen is the whole issue of this is a red wall voting territory. Suddenly they're up in arms. Johnson needs to address that. The issue of relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't like to be told no, and it was told no. So that was another issue. And it's actually a bit of a no-brainer for Boris Johnson, because going back to the red wall voting agenda, Saudi Arabians, they've injected 300 million quid into the economy to start off with. But the link to the Reuben brothers are property developers. We know what's happened with, for example, property at Manchester City through Abu Dhabi. So basically, Boris Johnson will get a nice new shiny red wall city, and he doesn't have to pay for it. So he makes good on his electoral promises. He keeps Saudi Arabia happy. Newcastle fans are all buying, as Tony said, are buying tea towels at Waitrose. So it's just a win-win-win all round.
And to be fair, the Reuben brothers have already made some investments in the region. The race course they've got some interest in, and other areas. Of course, all of this start to dilute what was rather sort of elated scenes from the fans themselves that really seem to have bought into the notion that actually these owners were actually transfixed on one thing and one thing only, and that is making Newcastle United the top club in the country. When does that start to unravel itself?
As soon as you start talking to the Saudi Arabians. As soon as you start talking to Mike Ashley, for that matter. I mean, for me personally, football killed my love of football. So now football is my 9 to 5 job. That's it, full stop. At the weekends I do other things, and I think whether we're talking about Ashley at United, or we're talking about the Glazers in Manchester, or the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris in Paris, this is no longer about football. This is football is just the means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And I think that we've mentioned the Reubens already. It's really important to kind of re-emphasize the Reubens, because just to go back to what we were also saying about Manchester City, what we know about Abu Dhabi and City is that Manchester City Council, in conjunction with the club and the Abu Dhabi investors, there's been a real estate boom in Manchester. For those of you who know Manchester, this is the Abu Dhabi of the Northwest. It's kind of gleaming towers, expensive apartments. Will that happen in Newcastle? I think there's a reasonable chance that it will. Because what the Saudi Arabians are looking to do is to take some of this oil and gas wealth that they've accumulated and put it to good use. And so we should expect to see that. I think the other thing as well to keep in mind, linked to it, is we know COP26 is taking place right now, a real kickback against oil and gas. The Saudi Arabians' wealth conceivably will slowly start to erode. So they got to start looking at making money from elsewhere. They got to look at other investment opportunities. So one of the things that they are doing, They're creating a mega city, Neom, which some people may know about. That's going to be supposedly the world's biggest sustainable city.
Wow.
So they're into wind power, they're into, you know, this kind of thing. That's part of their investment to diversify. But, you know, as Tony will know, you know, the Northeast very rapidly is also becoming Britain's wind power capital.
Yeah, I mean, Simon, you know, you mentioned that, and obviously there is one tower block already started. I think the Reuben brothers are behind that near the Swan House roundabout, which is right central Newcastle territory. We've had another big one built, Hadrian's Tower earlier. I do go to Manchester often, and every time in Manchester, there's another big block going up. So I can see that happening in my city, in Newcastle. And you're absolutely right. Our local news is literally full of wind turbine stories, the wind farms out in the North Sea, all of the injection of, and it's great for the Northeast. You know, we've got some jobs coming. We've got this sort of green revolution happening in the Northeast. And I mean, right through the Northeast, not just Newcastle, all the way through the Northeast. And that's got to be good.
Tony, say it. You've got to say it. You've got to say Middlesbrough. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We can all sleep easily now.
Listen, you're a Middlesbrough fan, Simon, so we perhaps shouldn't be doing this webinar, but we're talking about football. Well, we were talking about football. That's what's interesting for me. We're talking about football, and look at where it's led us to.
Absolutely. You know? Absolutely. So I'm listening very carefully to what you're saying, Simon, and my natural judgment on the back of it is that it doesn't really make sense for the IF to stop at one club. Surely they're going to look at that multi-club ownership that seems to be serving the City Group and other parties well.
So I think that's a good question, and I thought your question to Kieran about what happens next was a good question as well, because, you know, in some ways it is difficult to predict what happens next, but in other ways it's not. So there's a great phrase, mimetic isomorphism, copying. It basically means, so when you were sat with your gran on Christmas Day, if you want to kind of appear intellectual, you say, "Gran, can we have a chat about mimetic isomorphism?" And she said, when she says, Ryan lad, what does that mean? And you say, it's copying, Gran. That's what it means. So mimetic isomorphism, that's today's lesson.
I've learned something. I've learned something today, Simon. Honestly, fantastic.
So, but essentially, those Gulf nations, they copy. So Qatar has a Vision 2030 and a national development plan, of which sport is part. And then after that, the United Arab Emirates developed a Vision 2030 with a national development plan, of which sport is part. And now here we are, belatedly to the party. Saudi Arabia also has a 2030 vision and national development plan, of which sport is part. So they copy each other. So what Saudi Arabia will do is they will look to Paris Saint-Germain, they will look to Manchester City, and they will make an assessment of where they go next. I suspect that what we may see is a hybrid of the two. One of the things, I guess, in terms of Paris Saint-Germain, it is obviously, you've got a sexy city. It's very stylish. It's you know, sophisticated. And if you look at the way in which they're already developing the brand, you know, they're really playing to, you know, the Eiffel Tower and the best in the world. And so, you know, we will see some of that. But I think we conceivably will also see a franchise network. And I think particularly if we also follow, or Saudi Arabia also follows through on the creation of a new beIN Sport rivaling broadcasting service. You know, Saudi Arabia will want to sell content in France. They'll want to sell content in Germany and in China and in India and so on. So, you know, I can see elements of, you know, brand and place coming from Paris Saint-Germain, fashion collaborations coming from Paris Saint-Germain, at the same time drawing elements of kind of residential and property and the franchise network from City Football Group. But I do think, going back to the point that we made, Tony, is about wind power, because the Reubens are investing heavily in wind power. The Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund is investing heavily in wind power. Yeah. And the northeast of England is also becoming very quickly a centre for wind power.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just going back to the, you know, let's talk a bit more about football, because you know, it's going to be interesting to see what the first spend is on in Newcastle United, what the first big check is that they write, whether it's a foreign football club, a star player, a new training ground, whatever it is. I mean, if it was me, I think, you know, we'd like to see investment in the club itself, you know, and I think the first task is focusing on Newcastle United and being the best club it can be, I think. And so it'll be interesting to see what checks are written in the next short term, 3 to 6 to 9 months.
Yeah, Ryan, don't interrupt. I'm telling you, you know, I'm the teacher, okay? I'm noticing one or two of my former students in here, which is really disconcerting.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Joe Donker's on here, I think, as well.
Hi, Joe, you got mentioned.
You know, what a pain in the ass Joe was in. Sorry, Joe, I didn't mean that. You know that you know how I feel about you, Joe.
You've got a nice hello there.
So obviously Paris Saint-Germain paid nigh on 200 million quid for Neymar. If I was Newcastle United, I would get my checkbook out and pay 250 million quid for Ferran Soriano, the chief executive of City Football Group.
Wow.
Now, it's interesting, again, the previous conversation about Manchester City, for me, you'll remember Thaksin Shinawatra, we didn't mention him at Manchester City. Obviously, Shinawatra sold to Abu Dhabi in 2008, but from 2008 to 2011, basically City just signed players, and that was pretty much it. You know, with due respect to some of the people who were working there at the time, there wasn't this kind of big, bold vision of where the organization would go. In 2011, Ferran Soriano became chief executive of what then became City Football Group. So this multi-franchise global entertainment business with connections across the world, from, you know, private equity investor in LA through Abu Dhabi to China Media Capital in China, you know, and all of those things, the Citizens digital platform, you know, the tie-ups with Nissan. This week, stories about 20% stake in Spartak Moscow.
Yeah.
So all of this comes from not just Ferran Soriano himself, but what he then has done. You know, so Ferran Soriano is the Neymar of the team, but he's then gone back and he's signed Mbappe from Barcelona and he's signed Messi from Barcelona. So his chief operating officer, his chief marketing officer, they all came with him from Barca. So I think whilst a lot of us are saying, yeah, you know, Mbappe is going to score a hat-trick at St. James's Park, football killed my love of football. What I'm looking at is, what is the boardroom going to look like? What is the organization going to look like? What are they going to do with, for example, in marketing, globalization, digitalization? You're then into, in terms of human capital development, training facilities, and so on and so forth. So rather than talking about the players that they'll sign, and let's face it, you know, the players will sign for 3 years, could well leave and go somewhere else. But you look at off the field in football, very often people stay a lot longer and have a much bigger impact in terms of the kind of sustainability and viability of the organization. So 250 million quid for Soriano, that's what I would spend on.
It's a really interesting and valid point. And Tony, you and I have spoke many times about how few staff there are at Newcastle compared to comparable club in the Premier League. And yeah, and that's obviously something that's going to be addressed, you imagine, quite quickly.
Well, sorry, Sam, you go.
No, I was just going to say, you know, I work in a French business school based in Paris, but we also have a campus in Shanghai. So I spend part of my time in Shanghai as well. And for one of the first things that I did when I started working in Shanghai is I went to the Paris Saint-Germain park. So there's a Paris Saint-Germain theme park, which is a bit, you know, in truth, is not theme park, you know, it's not Disneyland, but they have a presence. And when you're in China, you know, the Bundesliga's got an office in town, Borussia Dortmund has got an office in town. I think, Tony, as you say, Newcastle United's probably still got someone sat in a ticket office somewhere selling match day programs, you know, and, you know, kind of a la Ayerson Park 1976. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but I do. And this is what I mean about ball watching. People are talking about upping the game on the pitch. Nobody's really talking about upping their game off the pitch. Just
to interject there, Simon, the team I support, Wolves, he talk about the copying. Okay, it's a Chinese investment firm, the Fosun Group, who I know you've obviously studied as well. Would they be a more relevant example for Newcastle to copy? I mean, Fosun have now they've got really heavily into the esports. They've set up a record label. There's a lot of I think you say Janjui, isn't it? The interconnected, connected nature of the businesses. Is that a more relevant example for the PIF guys to follow?
So when your gran on Christmas Day, Ryan has said, Ryan, you would be your big words, you mimetic isomorphism. You've changed. You've changed. You say, well, Gran, can I next talk to you about globalization? And I think Wolves is a really interesting example. We can talk about, if you want to talk about Fosun, we can talk about Fosun in just a second. But what Wolves are doing is really, really interesting because, as you'll know, Ryan, you can go to the Bund in Shanghai, and there's a really, really big, swanky shopping centre just over the river on the Bund in Shanghai. And you can go and see the Wolf shop in there, next to Chanel and Gucci and Armani. There's a Wolf shop there. Yeah. So this is very clearly targeted at middle-class consumers in China who buy lots of luxury brands, lots of luxury goods. Yet at the same time, Wolves has just announced that it's going to try and promote local artists in Wolverhampton and kind of boost that music scene. And we know that there's a connection between music and football locally. We know the soundtrack to our football matches at More Than You. We've all, just as I do at Ayresome Park, we've all got them. So I think it's a great example of globalization. So you're going global whilst you're localizing at the same time. And we see this with Manchester City again. And for those of you who've been following the recent kit launches of Manchester City and the Manchester, 1990s Hacienda, that is local. But at the same time, City's just announced 20% in Spartak Moscow. They've not just announced reports that's 20% in Spartak Moscow. Yeah. So globalization. So I think that's one of the things that Newcastle is going to have to get to grips with. Can I just say something on the people now managing the club as opposed to owning the club? I wonder how long that will continue. Yep. I have a pretty good idea how long it will continue, but I'm not going to say it publicly.
Yeah, not long then.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is the public investment fund it's being advised by consultants from McKinsey, from Bain, sitting in New York. They're the same consultants who advised the Abu Dhabi group when they bought City. They're the same consultants that are advising the Qataris at Paris Saint-Germain. And so I believe that sometime next year, what we will start to see, maybe by this time next year is really, I think you talked earlier, Tony, about rocket fuel. Certainly off the field, we'll start to see rocket fuel being put in the tank.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Simon, I'm really interested to a sense of what the reaction to the purchase has been back in Saudi Arabia. Like you said, they've got a well-established, well-functioning football system of their own. What the football fans think about the situation back home?
So I think fans in the region are really interesting because there's one set of fans who just don't care. Yeah, there's another set of fans, and there's quite a few friends of mine in Saudi Arabia who contacted me and said, "What is this all about? Can you explain it to us? Because they simply don't know why this has taken place." There's another group, and this is actually quite a big hardcore of fans in Saudi Arabia are saying, "Why are you spending overseas? Spend here."
Yeah.
Why aren't we signing big players? Why don't we get the best names? Why isn't our club in the Deloitte top 30 money league? So that and they're quite vocal in their dissent. And then you've got this other group, which and I always think that fans in the Gulf region are interesting because they tend to have 4 teams. So they've got a local team, a local club, an international club, and then they'll have their own national team and an international national team. So they're kind of portfolio fans. They retain this portfolio of clubs. And what's really, really interesting, places like Abu Dhabi and Qatar, is like Paris Saint-Germain, Manchester City are now the local clubs.
Wow.
and people will gather in bars and watch it. They obviously they won't drink alcohol and watch on TV. They'll drink coffee and soft drinks.
Yeah.
But that's their team, that's their local team playing. So it is entirely conceivable that you'll get these enclaves of Magpies fans in Riyadh and Jeddah and elsewhere, and Newcastle will become their local team.
I also really want to ask you. We know that China has put the drawbridge back a little bit in terms of investment or what's allowable within their domestic league. What's happened to Newcastle trigger another territory to think, oh, we're going to miss out on what is a valuable, as you've touched on, marketing asset? Is there a player that you see that hasn't yet raised its head but will do?
That's a really, really great question, Ryan. Again, a lot of people are ball watching. It's all about the Premier League and it's all about the owners and directors test. And they should have done this and they shouldn't have done it. They should have done that. At the same time and again, fan-led review, because let's be honest, that's a variable in the recent equation as well. Whilst we've been having this debate, in Germany, they've been having a separate debate, because, of course, they don't have Saudi Arabian investors or Abu Dhabi investors or American investors. So whilst Newcastle United fans are thinking about, well, we're going to sign Mbappe, the fans of Borussia Dortmund, no chance that's going to happen, just no chance. So there's a big debate in Germany about, in competitive advantage terms, are we losing out by being so democratic?
Yeah.
And so I think, in terms of the British experience or the English experience and the German experience, what we essentially are doing in the West is we're soul searching right now, because money from elsewhere in the world is really driving the big decisions. And my view about governance is, stop talking about the owners and directors test, stop talking about the Premier League, because essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to govern transnational organizations. If the Premier League, if we're talking about the Premier League, if the Premier League was trying to make a decision on Steve Gibson at Middlesbrough, born in Middlesbrough, lives in Middlesbrough, does his business in Middlesbrough, it's easy. But if you're talking about, for example, Abu Dhabi and City Football Group, which has got owners from 3 different countries and is operating currently in 10 different territories, what price your owners and directors test? And the comparison that I would make is with Amazon and tax, or with Starbucks and tax. How can the British government effectively control Amazon, which is not based here, and has got operations all over the world and multiple locations, even in Britain itself? In the end, what we've got with Amazon and tax is the British government had to strike a deal. So the rule, Amazon, let's be honest, the Amazon circumvented the rules. British government had to strike a deal. And I think that unless UEFA or unless FIFA really gets to grips with this, then what we'll see more and more is deals will be struck. And let's be absolutely clear about this. The Premier League, the British government, the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, when it came to the Newcastle United purchase, they struck a deal.
Yeah. Simon, I'm agreeing with a lot of what you're saying there. And I think my 2 central things, and I think it's got to be FIFA and UEFA. I don't think the Premier League can possibly deliver on this. And I think one of the central things I think is, should countries really be owning football clubs? Should countries, that question. And the other one is, I don't really buy into this multi-club franchise system. I think each club is a unique entity that serves a purpose in that particular place, in that particular country. And yes, I totally get how multi-club systems and having a couple of clubs in different countries. And let's say Newcastle, for me, you go where the talent is. Let's buy one in Brazil and buy one in France, and you've got a nice group there where you can talk about players. And I'm very much, trying to ignore those big political forces that are going on. I'm trying to bring us back to this is a football club. It's in my city. My 2 boys support it. And what does it look like? And what does it stand for? And I don't think when you're talking about countries owning clubs and the multi-club approach, because in the multi-club approach as well, Man City's the top dog. Let's not make any, everyone else. If you've got a good player at your club, that player's going to end up in Man City if he's a top player. No question about it. He's not going to stay at New York or wherever else they've got clubs. That whole system's feeding up to Man City, and I think that doesn't create a very level playing field.
Yeah, I think before you answer, Simon, I think to pick on a point, there is a bit of soul searching going on with everyone. And when I saw those scenes outside of Newcastle, you've got young teenagers, people in their early 20s, celebrating as if it's the greatest day ever. And really, for me, that's a sort of reflection of whatever is going on in their lives in terms of what drives their emotions. There's a cant that was going around saying we've got our club back. The way I see it, the club has never been less theirs than what it is now. And your point of what is a football club, and this is a central bit to a lot of my work, it's quite hard to define, but my definition of a club is it's the only place you can go to be patriotic about where you're from. And actually, for most people, it's the only tradition that's left in their lives. In order for all of that to come together, the club has to be a reflection of the place that it's from, the place that it exists in. I think this is the big challenge for all owners moving forward. But Simon, what's your reaction to Tony's comment there?
I mean, one of the things that I didn't say at the start is, I was born in Middlesbrough. I was brought up in Middlesbrough. I went to school in Middlesbrough. For the first 10 years of my life, I lived at number 10 Ayson Park Road, right opposite the football ground. Fantastic. So my dad died a long time ago. I've not had that conversation about why he bought that house, but I can imagine, given that he was a season ticket holder. So, I understand, and I'm Borough till I die. I understand completely that was my young life. But my more mature, older life is that, that world is gone. It's gone. It's over. It's finished. And I'm reminded of, and you probably see me tweet this, Ricky Gervais's Golden Globes speech in 2004. And he stands up and he says to the Americans, "I'm from Britain. We used to run the world before you did." And I think if I was to win a Golden Globe right now, I'd stand up in Riyadh and I'd say, I am from Britain. We used to run the world before the Americans, before you took over and started running the world on their behalf. So I think the reality is that the British don't run the world anymore. The Saudi Arabians do, the Qataris do, the Chinese do. I think the Americans still do to a significant extent. And so what we are left with is trying to get to grips with what football in the 21st century means for us, because, old gadgies like Tony and me, that's gone. Those days have gone. And what we're faced with, and for a young pup like you, Ryan, asking questions about what's a football club, I think that's a perfectly valid and a really important question to ask. I wrote 3 things down. I work in France. I voted to remain. I'm a strong supporter of the European Union. But over the last 20 years, the European Union has done nothing. The Chinese have bought Inter Milan. The Americans have bought Marseille. Abu Dhabi has bought Manchester City. Now the Saudi Arabians have bought Newcastle United. The European Union has just sat and watched whilst we've sold off our sporting assets. Yeah. So I don't think it's just UEFA. I don't think it's just FIFA. I actually think it's bigger than that. I think organizations like UEFA have to do something. Governments have to do something. And they don't appear inclined to do that.
Sorry, just on that point, because it's a really interesting point, and I've done some stuff with UEFA over the last year. For me, that point doesn't even seem on their radar.
Yeah, and it's all about football.
Yeah.
It's all about football, and then the second thing is about revenue generation. So football revenue generation, and then the broader context, which is and go back to stop ball watching. Your 70 or 80 eye movements a minute. But these kinds of bigger issues, I think they're huge, they're complicated, they're controversial, But it's a bit like fiddling while Rome burns. Another football club gets sold to another foreigner, another owner from outside Europe. We sit here saying, "Yay, it's a great thing." Lots of other people there sit there saying, "Well, where's the soul of English football or European football gone?" Nobody's doing anything about it. The one thing about multiple, if I could talk about multiple ownership, Tony, is Tony, you remember Ria's on Linthorpe Road?
Chrissy Ria's, yeah.
Chrissy Ria's mum and dad.
Mum and dad with the ice cream shops.
Yeah, Chrissy Ria's
memory. Sorry for everyone who's not from Middlesbrough watching this watching this webinar, but we're going down memory lane in Middlesbrough. Yeah.
But everybody knows driving home for Christmas. Chris Ria, his mum and dad, Italian immigrants, at a cafe on Linthorpe Road. That's where we went to drink our coffee and eat our ice cream. Nowadays, most of us go to Starbucks, and Starbucks is a global franchise network. Yeah. We don't seem to have a problem with that. Yet most of us, when we drink, historically, you go to Ria's on Linthorpe Road, it's about identity and family and community. Yet suddenly, when we apply it to football, we seem to have an issue. And I think there is something about modern consumers and industrialization and the commercial development, not just of coffee shops, but of football clubs as well. And again, we need to think about the ramifications of this. And I think from City's point of view, as the most obvious franchise, as you mentioned, Tony, there are two dimensions to it. One is about talent acquisition and management.
Yeah.
It's a global scouting network.
Yeah.
It's get in there first, get the best players first, keep them, develop them. If they're not looking any good, you can move them across your franchise network or dispose of them. If they are looking good, what you do is you park them. You park them in New York. Jack Harrison springs to mind. Manchester. Yep. You park Jack Harrison in New York. Have a look at him. Send him on loan to Middlesbrough. You think, well, he's not going to make the first team. We'll sell him to Leeds. So it's about talent management. But I think the other dimension of City Football Group is about this global entertainment business that I mentioned earlier. It's about creating a commercial infrastructure that goes beyond football. There's a synergy with football, but it goes beyond football. And I think the investment that the Manchester City owners have made into Reliance in India, big digital business, Bollywood, financial center of India, massive middle class, something like 237 billionaires in India, incredible. So a football club, Ryan, is something more than
100%, of course, absolutely. And to pick up your point about Ria's, that, and again, it's the ball watching analogy. Society has changed. The high street is homogenized. You could plonk somebody in any town and they wouldn't know where they are because it's the same shop, it's the same structure, it's the same everything. And I think the process, and again, this is a lot of the work that I do, is we've got to evidence and come to terms that this is a lesser experience of fandom than what you had, than what my dad had, than what his granddad had. And to absorb that is really at conflict with what modern status-driven societies, so why do they go to Starbucks and not locally run cafe? Well, they want to check in, don't they? And they want to be seen with the brand of Starbucks.
So my son is 20 years old, and he's a bit of a dude, and he says to me, well, why don't you get yourself a Paris Saint-Germain Air Jordan, top, and get yourself get kind of skin tight. And maybe get myself a nice baseball cap and go and watch Messi and Neymar at Parc des Princes. And instead, right, Tom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on a really horrendously wet, cold Wednesday night in the middle of November and watch Middlesbrough get stuffed 3-0 at home. He just doesn't understand. He doesn't understand it in terms of his consumption choices. Yep. He just doesn't understand that.
Yeah. Simon, I had I was at Luton Town, Middlesbrough. Luton Town, and everyone who's ever been to Luton, it's a real old-fashioned football experience. I was in the away end, a standing room only. I was looking for my seat naively. I was looking for a seat. The steward just said, "Oh, listen, just stand where you want." Singing, camaraderie, getting back on the bus. The guys getting on the bus after the game. The narrow streets, the sort of terrace streets in that part of Luton. And it was a real sort of blast from the past for me. And do you know what? It gave me a warm feeling, and I enjoyed it. And I had a Bovril at half time just to sort of complete the trip down memory lane type of thing. And it really was that for me. And I know I've been, when I go to football matches, normally I'm not stood and I'm not with the away fans, but it was a great experience. And it brought it back to what you said about Ayresome Park and going to matches with your dad or whoever else. But I do sort of hanker back for that sort of world.
Yeah, but Simon, is the globalization that enough of an antidote to that? Is it just scratching the surface?
Well, I sort of feel for the Newcastle fans. I want them to be happy. I want them to have a good experience. A lot of my friends who live in the city who were season ticket holders, they turned their back on the club under Ashley. They didn't want to go to games because they didn't feel the relationship. They felt the relationship had broken down, and they weren't enjoying going to the games anymore. And these are, long-term season ticket holders. So I want, to come out of this and come out of the purchase of Newcastle. I hope the custodians, and I always use custodians because they're not here forever. I hope these group of custodians can really do right by the fans. The fans their expectations have probably gone through the roof, and hopefully listening to us today, they might have dampened down some of the expectations in terms of spending. But, if Newcastle, and it's odd that you come into the club in October, you've got a January transfer window, which isn't easy to negotiate in the best of times. Lee Charnley, the chief exec, he's still at the club, helping in the changeover. I can't expect that he'll be there, in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. But obviously, Lee did a really good job at the club under difficult circumstances. And as Kieran was saying, it was well run financially. The new custodians that have come in, is there any football people amongst them? I don't know. Who's doing the football business down there? So I just hope that these new custodians do right by the fans, that do some business in January, because I think, I looked at the age of the Newcastle squad. Look, everyone can look at the league position, and they might have been unlucky in a couple of games and picked up, they could have picked up a few more points. But when you look at the squad of Newcastle United as we speak, there's a lot of players there who are 29. There's quite a few 32s. It's quite an old squad compared to somebody like Villa, for example. I mean, when we talk about who should we be comparing Newcastle United to, for me at the moment, or the next step would be the likes of Leicester. We haven't got a guy on today, but the likes of Leicester, Aston Villa even, Everton was mentioned. It's those sort of second, from 7 to 12, those sort of teams that Newcastle should try and be in the short term, and then maybe kick on. And if the money does come in the big numbers that people have talked about, then be able to kick on. Because I think both Kieran and Simon have been right. It's a different Premier League now to what the Chelsea owners, the Man City owners bought into.
You finished there, Tone?
Yeah.
He's used up all his words for the entire year.
Yeah, that's it. So things don't go well, Simon, right? Say they get relegated this year, which is what I'm saying is going to happen. I can't see them, regardless of who they buy, regardless of who they're getting as manager. I think they're going down personally. How are these people going to react to a bit of flack from supporters? And moving to Tony's point, I'm picking up from what you're saying in terms of what the purpose of this investment in, actually the sort of a genuine appeasement of the people, the good people of Newcastle, isn't that high on the priority list.
So can I firstly say, I hope they don't get relegated, because the Northeast deserves at least one, ideally two, or maybe even three Premier League clubs, because I still think the passion for football in the Northeast is as incredible as it's ever been. So I really hope they don't get relegated. It's interesting that you use the word custodians, Tony, because in my experience, Gulf investors own things. They're not custodians of things. They own things. So this raises an important issue moving forward. Obviously, at the moment, they have a woman, a local woman, who is representing their interests publicly. And I think whatever happens to this woman long term, they have to have someone there who really understands and gets it locally, because the message has to come across that they do care and that they are custodians, because ultimately the football product, when you're trying to sell it, if there's nobody in the stadium, then it doesn't look good, and it doesn't achieve the commercial returns that you want it to. So you still need fans in there, and so you still need to show them that you care. So even if you're not a custodian, you need to look like one and smell like one. I think as far as failure is concerned, again, having spent a lot of time in the Gulf, they do success very, very well. They do failure very, very badly. I would think they would see a relegation for 1 year as a bump in the road and an inconvenient reality. But if we're talking about 2 years in the Championship or 3 years in the Championship or a relegation beyond that or another relegation, they would not be happy. And my view is they would dispose of it. They would dispose of it because in terms of status and prestige, all of that said, that kind of contradicts some of the things that I said earlier. Obviously, if you can utilize the football club as the means through which to achieve other ends, then if it's a mid-table Championship side for the rest of our entire existence, then they possibly won't mind too much, because if they can use the club to do business, then that's what they will do. It's interesting because as when Tony was talking, I was thinking about the corporate boxes of Champions League games. And I think that is the ultimate goal. And of course, if you can say, hey, we own the club that won the Champions League this season, that's an amazing thing. But what I always find amazing is who you find in corporate boxes at Champions League games. I'll not mention names, but the last corporate box at a Champions League game that I was in, Russian gas officials and senior politicians from a European government. And of course, you don't have to go through normal diplomatic channels. You don't have to put a request in to meet the minister and then wait for 2 years to get. What you do is you say, "Hey, come to our game. We'll give you 5 tickets to a Champions League. We got Juventus coming this week." People don't say no. They go. They have a nice, they have a drink and a nice meal, and they chat at halftime about those gas supplies that you're trying to arrange, and this happens. This happens. And that's the reality. And I think this is one of the hidden sides. Ball watching again, Kylian Mbappe scoring his hat trick. So when he does score his hat trick at St. James's Park, I'm going to be looking at the corporate boxes and thinking, well, who's that person from the European Union talking to the Gazprom guy? What are they talking about? Because I think that's the reality of this kind of elite professional football now, is the connections and the business networks that it enables.
Absolutely. Right, we're coming to the end, so I just want to get through a couple of the questions that have come in. A really good question, I think, from Carl. The question is, does the panel think it is right appointing a manager before a technical director or director of football, which seems is the model the owners prefer? Also, as Newcastle's recruitment team has dwindled under the Ashley regime, and who do you think will be directing the recruitment moving forward? Tony, I'll put that to you firstly.
Yeah.
I think Carl makes good points. Sporting director first, the manager?
It's a great question, Carl. Yeah, and thanks for that. I totally agree. I think, a sporting director into Newcastle, if they are going to make some substantial changes to the club, I think, a sporting director at Newcastle would be a great thing. And I think then that sporting director is then heavily involved in deciding who the head coach is. I think that way around is the most sensible way around. You don't want a sporting director turning up. Maybe he doesn't have the relationship with the head coach if the head coach is already in situ. So for me, sporting director first. Interestingly, we had Les Ferdinand on one of these webinars this time last year, I think. And obviously Les is a sporting director of football at QPR. And obviously, you know, with greatest respect to QPR, somebody of Les's stature in the game who knows this country, knows the fans as well, would be a really great option. You know, I'm not saying that's what the club should go. Hey, they could go, you know, for a foreign sporting director or whatever. But I do agree with Carl. I think sporting directors should come first.
Simon, I mean, you know, you spoke about it. Heavyweights off the field will likely come at some point. So if it is Eddie Howe now, is that, in terms of what the thinking might be, is that just get somebody in for now, and actually the future structure will have to reassess whether he's the right man a little bit later on?
I've got no views on Eddie Howe, to be honest. As I say, football killed my love of football. I mean, what I would be more interested in is organization structure and talent acquisition and development. And you know, we all hear about, you know, buying players, developing players, having a style, you know, having a philosophy, etc. That applies equally off the field. And getting get some people. So this is your third term for Christmas Day with you, Gran. Gran, can I talk to you about organizational architecture? And I think, you know, kind of getting the internal organizational architecture right. You know, getting the right people in the right positions in terms of sporting performance, but also in terms of commercial performance too. But also in terms of the physical infrastructure, having the right training facilities, the right state. We don't mention stadium because I don't think you can. I don't think St James's Park is enough. I think they're going to have to move, because that stadium as it stands doesn't fulfill what I think the purpose will be for Saudi Arabia. So I think it's getting that internal organizational architecture right that's the most important thing. Not whether it's Eddie Howe or anybody else.
It took us right to the end of the webinar for somebody to ask the question, and I knew it was coming at some point. And that's this notion that's been thrown around about sports washing. So, you know, listening to what you've had to say today, is that a bit of a red herring in terms of your eyes?
So I think sport washing, it's important that we talk about sport washing, and it is an issue. And you know, we know throughout the history of sport, not just now with Saudi Arabia, we know through the history, you know, British colonial times, communist Russia, you know, we know throughout sporting history, there are episodes which we can label as sport washing. But you know, I use the same phrase again. I think anybody who thinks this is all about sport washing is ball watching. Because it's not. It's about much, much more. I think it's important to have the debate. I think it's important for fans who feel uncomfortable to raise this as an issue. I feel it's important for rights groups like Amnesty International to highlight it. But it's not just about sport washing. It's a much, much bigger issue than that. Just to add to that, when I've sat in meetings in the Gulf region, you know, I've never ever been to a meeting where you know, anybody from the region has said, right, lads, you know, what we're going to do about this sport washing thing? You know, how can we fool people into thinking that we're great guys when actual facts, you know, where we're doing other dirty deeds? You know, it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So this is a label that the West applies.
Yeah,
it's not a label that they apply. In fact, when I'm in the Gulf region, people very often will say, "Why do you hate us so much? Why do you keep saying these things about us?" So, yes, sport washing is important, but I think, you know, it's just one part of the equation.
Brilliant. Hope that answers your question, Adam. Right, Tony, that's brought us towards the end of webinars. What's been an absolutely fascinating 90 minutes. I'm probably left with more questions than answers, which I think is always a really, really good place to be. Before we thank everybody and let people go, you're just going to talk briefly about Football Transfer Forum Live, which is returning in a couple of weeks. We're very excited. I've got my haircut booked in. Everything's arranged. So yeah, off you go, Tony. I'll share the slides.
Yeah, we getting away from 2D, and we're actually back in the real world, and here we are. It's less than 3 weeks away now. So, the planning's been going on for a long time. I've had quite a few sleepless nights. We've got probably, well, the speakers speak for themselves. Victor Orta, fantastic, Leeds United, had another Middlesbrough with a relationship to Middlesbrough, Sevilla. He trained under Monchi as a sporting director, so top draw. Marcus Motta, who is the leading sports agent from Brazil, Neymar deal, the biggest deal in the world he did. He's actually joining us remotely from South America. And then we've got Steve Walsh coming back to Leicester, where he, we know he signed some very, very good players as part of the staff at Leicester, Vardy, Kante, Mahrez, absolutely unbelievable. He was there when they won the Premier League, which still, you just can't believe that it happened. So we're all going to be together in a couple of weeks' time at Leicester City Football Club. We've had a really great response from clubs. There's a lot of club badges on there. We've got people from clubs of different levels, lots of sporting directors, loan managers, club scouts, agents, lawyers. It's, I think we're looking like it's going to be the biggest football transfer forum live ever. Certainly the numbers just keep going up and up. And then we've had a great response from companies. You can see some of the badges there. I won't go through the names of the companies that, we've got maybe another couple to add to that list who are just coming on board in the last couple of days. So really, it's just going to be a fantastic event. I'll be wearing the blue suit to welcome you to the King Power Stadium. And and that's it, really. That's it. We're back in the real world, Ryan. It's back to real world stuff.
So in terms of that, Tony, any people from clubs or agents tuning in today, if they wanted to come, tickets still available, how do they get them?
Yeah, we've gone invitation only this year because of the demand. So please just direct message me on LinkedIn or through through my email address, which everyone should have. But direct message me on LinkedIn, or if you've got my number on WhatsApp, and I'll get an invite out to you. Obviously, Simon was there at Middlesbrough at the very first football transfer forum, and
I might make it to this one if they let me back. If they let me back into the country, I might make it to this one as well.
Simon, you're absolutely very, very welcome. We'd love to have you there. We have got a representative from Middlesbrough, so you'll feel at home.
Are the French letting Brits out of the country now, Simon?
It's the Brits not letting people in rather than the French.
Oh, right. Okay. But listen, Simon, thank you very much for your
guys.
Again, not only your time this morning, but the knowledge that you've built up, your expertise that has been invaluable to everybody looking on, not only in this deal, I'm sure in deals to come in the future as well. And Tony, I started the webinar off 90 minutes ago where the government was undoing their political capital. In the midst of that 90 minutes, yet another U-turn has taken place. And wow, there'll be no U-turns at the Football Transfer Forum Live. We'll be absolutely straight as a die. Anybody that can make it, please do. Really appreciate everybody's attention and attendance this morning as well, and hope everybody has a good rest of the week. Thank you again, Simon and Tony.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers,
Thanks,
guys.
Simon.
Bye.
Bye.